Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. A federal election has been called for April 28th, and whomever is running the country the next day is going to need to take a close look at the books at a time Canada is facing significant economic and sovereign threats from the United States. But manifest destiny isn't the only concern the country's future finance minister will have to address. Living standards are stagnant, productivity is low, and the country is spilling red ink. This is Bill Robson, President and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute, and Don Drummond, a Stafford Dunning Fellow and Adjunct Professor at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University and a Fellow in Residence at the Institute. In the shadow of Donald Trump, they, alongside colleague Alexandre Laurent, offer Ottawa a shadow budget aimed at restoring fiscal surpluses by 2028, lowering the debt ratio, and reining in federal program spending. But how can we get our fiscal house in order in the era of Trump tariff flip-flops, threats to annex our country financially or physically, and the Depression-era echoes he inspires? Bill and Don join us now. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, you're welcome.
Help this non-economist understand how we can even crunch numbers accurately at this point. What kind of assumptions, Bill, can you make about the country's economy as Trump threatens our fiscal and literal sovereignty?
The level of uncertainty for framing a fiscal plan right now is very high. And so you have to pick a set of numbers that you think you can live with and that are going to be, I guess, resilient in the face of whatever comes at us. We did spend a bit of time, and I'm sure that every government that's framing a budget, including the federal government, gets around to its. We spent a bit of time trying to think what the various scenarios might have been. And at the end of it, we decided that the thing to do was to shade. Normally, we would just run with whatever the forecast from the federal government was in their fall economic statement. This time, we thought we have to shade it down a bit from that, but not knowing how big the tariffs are going to be, and also thinking that a lot of what is been announced by the Trump administration or mused about by the Trump administration might turn out to be bluster. We decided we've got to have a little bit of downward pressure on real output, and the uncertainty alone would mean that there'd be less consumer spending and less business investment. But when it comes to the revenue outlook, perhaps prices are going to be a little higher because the Canadian dollar being down, and there might be some retaliatory tariffs. So we did have a baseline that's a little bit more pessimistic than what the government had put out, but it's a recognizable world. We're certainly not forecasting or expecting the end of the world. And there are always, when you put together a budget, there are contingency reserves. There are things that you can do if things turn out dramatically worse than you expected. But, a fiscal plan has to make sense. The government needs a fiscal plan. You can't do what they did during COVID and just say, well, we won't have a budget because we don't know what's going on. So I hope that kind of gives people a sense of what we did. A bit of downward shading, but nothing that made the world unrecognizable. The challenges are still what they were.
Don, your time in the finance department, is there anything that you can compare it to today?
Well, there's two things I would like to ultimately be able to compare the current situation to, and that would be the implementation, the debate really first on free trade agreement back in the 1980s, and then the attack really resolving the fiscal problem for quite a long time in the mid-1990s. It's the two examples of my time where politicians took bold actions that were controversial that turned out quite well. Allegedly actions that were going to be unpopular, but it is interesting if you look at the political record, both governments, in one case Brian Mulroney's Conservatives, the other Jean Chrétien's Liberals with Paul Martin as the finance minister, got reelected. Those are my shining examples. As an editorial in the Globe and Mail said recently, Canadians want their politicians to take bold action. That's not what we're getting so far in this election campaign. It's still early days. We're getting a little goodie here and a little goodie there. We're not getting bold action. I would like to see that playbook played back and somebody do something that's really bold and address not just the tariff threat, but the underlying weaknesses of the Canadian economy, the weak productivity, the stagnant living standards, the lack of diversification, etc. That's what we need. That's not what we're getting right at the moment.
Your shadow budget, though, restores surpluses by 2028-29. How do we accomplish, Don, what you want to see in a budget, as well as balance things within the next few years?
Well, I will just confess there was moments that we wondered whether we should even do this, knowing there wasn't even going to be a government, there wasn't going to be a budget, but we always said government should have one before the new year. We have to be true to our own principles, and I'm really, really glad we did it right now because of exactly what's saying. We had to do a lot of things that weren't fun, and they wouldn't be fun for the population, too, in particular, to create the room to do the key things like lowering personal and corporate income taxes and building up defense spending, which is not just to satisfy some NATO commitment, it's actually to defend our country. It's a real need. We had to raise the GST rate and we had to dramatically lower non-defense spending. Those aren't fun for any government. They're certainly not any fun for the public. And having that as an anchor to me is so important because it says every single day when you get multi-billion-dollar announcements that, wait a minute, these are all completely unfunded and you're not even recognizing the fiscal problem you started with, never mind the one that's likely to get worse going forward. We had to do that. And it's not all fun and games.
Bill, break it down for us. What is it that allows us to restore surpluses as early as 2028?
Well, the thing that allows it is fundamentally a crunch on the federal government's operating spending. It's not hard to look at those numbers and say, wow, could the world ever be different? Because there's been this explosion of federal government hiring. The headcount's gone way up. All of those new public servants cost money in the here and now with their wages and salaries. And then there's a long tail on that too because of the growing pension entitlement. Alongside that, there's been something that's probably gotten more attention relative to the dollar amounts, but it's still very striking, the huge increase that's occurred in contracting out of various kinds. And so you have to ask the obvious question, if the federal government has been adding to its headcount at this amazing rate, going up by 40% over the course of a decade, then why on earth are they also contracting out for all these things? So what we did was we said, okay, we really have to put the brakes on that. And the kinds of spending cuts that we're talking about, they are double-digit annual amounts by the time you get to the end of the projection period, but they don't actually even lower spending back to where it was before 2015, before the in the days of the Harper government. So although these numbers look very dramatic, they're doable. The federal government would not cease to exist. It would not cease to do the services that it does right now. And that's really at the core of it. I might just take advantage of the fact that I've got the floor right now to emphasize something that Don touched on. And Michael, it's implicit in your question. The shadow budget adds up. One of the things that is very disturbing about what we're hearing in the election campaign so far is that the whole idea that you have to have a costed program, that you have to show how it all fits together and what happens to the bottom line. Maybe that's coming, but we haven't seen it so far, and we certainly haven't heard any talk about it so far. And I think that Canadians are entitled to expect and ought to demand that any political party that's making these promises should show how it all fits together. Our shadow budget has some things in it that people may raise people's eyebrows. I don't think the idea of increasing the GST is going to be popular, and certainly in Ottawa there's going to be consternation about cutting the operating spending. The key point is, though, you add and subtract, get to the bottom line. It's all there. It explains how to do it, and that's what we need from our real-life political masters and would-be masters.
All right, and now that I've got the floor, let me come back to something you had pointed out a little bit earlier. I understand the Institute's concerns about a growing civil service being a recurring cost to the country. If you're putting a multi-year ceiling on expenses like federal payroll, is that code for civil service job cuts?
I don't think that it's necessary to fire a lot of people. And certainly I wouldn't recommend anything like what's going on south of the border. But if you simply cease hiring and you look at the demography of the federal public service, there's a lot of retirement happening, maybe too much, because a lot of it is people who are hitting their pension entitlement for a richer pension at a younger age than is available outside the federal public service. But what I would go to is the concern that would underlie that if you're not actually in Ottawa or you don't work for the federal government, it's, well, what happens to the federal government services? The federal government does provide some important frontline services. They look after passports. They look after the border. They collect taxes. And it's very striking to see how the headcount has gone up, but their performance in these various areas doesn't seem to have gone up commensurately. Many people would say it hasn't improved at all. The federal government, other than that, is a big check writing machine, and you can certainly do that a lot more efficiently than what we've been seeing. So it's a little bit like Don alluded already to the cuts that happened under Paul Martin. Some of them were quite visible and painful in various ways. Cuts to transfers to the provinces, for example, because the provinces deliver a lot of frontline services and they had to make some changes. But for most people, it didn't produce any problem at all. And in fact, we learned quite quickly that we could get by with a federal government that was quite a bit smaller than it used to be, notwithstanding all the angst at the beginning.
Don, the shadow budget recommends a shift of the tax budget from taxes that you believe undermine work and investment. That's something that you pointed out a little bit earlier. So how does this work?
Well, the two things we really got to address in Canada is the high marginal tax rates on corporations and business. This is what you pay on any additional income. When we started off in the year 2000, which interestingly enough was the last budget I was involved with the federal government, we started on a campaign to lower our corporate tax rate. And we actually created an advantage with the United States and many other countries for a while. But then they responded, principally the United States responded, and we've lost that advantage over time. We need that. We're a small economy. Even having the same corporate tax rate as a bigger economy like the United States with all their economies and scale and access to bigger markets, probably not good enough. So we need to come back and restore our corporate tax advantage. We have very high personal income tax rates. Many people in Canada, particularly those people who have children in the middle income range who are losing things like the child benefit as they lose income, could keep less than half of the dollar that they earn. So if you're considering of getting training, getting another education, getting a better job, working additional hours, etc., you have to wonder, is it really worthwhile? I don't get to keep very much of it. We have to lower those rates. Unfortunately, it's expensive. You got over 20 million people, million people in Canada filing income taxes. Just to give people a couple of $100 is costing billions and billions of dollars, which is you have to come that other side that Bill was referring to. There has to be a funding for it. And in our case, it was really taking an axe to some elements of the non-defense spending and raising the GST. But with that goal in mind of getting our marginal tax rates down to make our economy more competitive, to sharpen those incentives to work, save, and invest.
I will commend Don for the part that he played when he was a federal public servant, getting the deficit down. In fact, more than that, getting us into budget surplus territory. So all that evil magic of compound interest that works against you when the debt's rising and your interest payments are rising turned around. And the federal government's fiscal health was quite remarkable. The debt burden fell. And there was a lot of room for tax cuts. We had the corporate tax cuts that Don alluded to. We had very significant personal tax cuts as well. And when you look at the macroeconomic performance of Canada after that happened, a lot went right. One of the things that you occasionally hear from people who really ought to know better is that we did a lot of the things, including what Don was just talking about, getting the marginal tax rates on people and on business investment down. And they say, well, it didn't work. It did work. If you look at the course of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, you can see that Canada's investment performance picked up. Our economic growth rates were solid, and we actually closed, we didn't close completely, but we narrowed a long-standing investment gap against the United States, and we actually caught up to other developed countries. For the last decade, the story has been spectacularly different, and I think a lot of the reason for that is what Don alluded to. We had an edge, but we lost it. And we particularly lost our edge against the United States in 2017 when they did their very significant corporate tax reform that really lowered the tax rate on investment in the United States. And you can see that U.S. investment really picked up then. And it seems to have happened partly at the expense of other countries, when you had companies that decided that the U.S. had become a much more attractive place to operate. So I do think that now would be a very good time for Canada to address that. The threats that Trump is making, the uncertainty. We've seen a lot of fresh enthusiasm for reducing interprovincial trade barriers. We've seen a lot of fresh enthusiasm for getting our energy resources to markets other than the United States. One of the things that we ought to be focusing on as we're looking for ways to make Canada stronger and more resilient is to get rid of or reduce the burden of some of these taxes that have clearly held us back. So our shadow budget puts a fair premium on doing that.
Liberal leader Mark Carney killed the hike in the capital gains exclusion rate and increased the lifetime capital gains exemption limit to $1.25 million on the sale of a small business share. Is this the right move?
You know, there's certain things you wear from your past, and coming back to that period the bill was talking about, I was responsible for tax policy when we brought into place the half inclusion rate. And it made sense because we don't allow any inflation adjustments on capital gains. So you might have bought an asset way back in 1990 and now you're selling it. Almost all the tax you're paying is just an inflation gain. It's not a real gain. You don't want to tax that fully. So the move that the government made absolutely no sense. Why they put it in the context of class adjustment made no sense either, has been pointed out time and time again. It's just not affecting wealthy people. Many people, at least once in their life, has a substantial gain. It might be on a rental property. It could be on a recreational property. It should have been some shares in a railway that they got from their parents long time ago. This has affected an awful lot of people. The way that it was handled was just an absolutely nightmare. Everything they did about it was terrible. They arbitrarily picked a sudden death deadline that you had to have dealt with it to avoid it. Maybe that's fine if you had some publicly traded shares, not fine if you had privately traded shares, not fine if it was in a piece of real estate. You couldn't sell it. They obviously wanted a quick hit to their revenues so they could come under the promised deficit target. Who cares about that? And why do you want to distort people's life? The whole thing was just an absolute disaster. Amazing how they just kept digging in and defending it. Thank goodness that is gone. Not just the measure itself, but the way it was delivered, I thought was just absolutely scandalous.
Let me pile on, if I could. I agree with what Don just said, and I want to emphasize that the capital gains inclusion rate increase was a egregious example, but it was not unique, of kind of populist tax policy made on the fly. Right away when that proposal came out, there were a lot of people who said, you just haven't thought this through properly. The way that you framed it with the different inclusion rate for people above or with capital gains above or below $250,000, the fact that the rules for corporations and trusts would be different. I mean, it simply stunk of something cooked up by sort of with a communications focus, as opposed to thinking about what's good tax policy and what's administratively feasible. Because as Don was pointing out, it wasn't administratively feasible, and they just made a complete hash of it. So in our shadow budget, we mention a handful of other tax policies that in our minds were motivated entirely by the motive to, people are unhappy with banks, so let's stick the banks with a particular tax. People are upset with the rich, so let's tax planes and boats and cars above a certain, actually quite low price. Anyway, there are other elements of recent tax policy that kind of fit under that populist appeal and no logic to it and no attention given or totally inadequate attention given to the administrative and compliance costs. And so in our shadow budget, we recommend just get rid of all that stuff. The revenue that you're raising from them is very small. In many cases, it's less than the cost of administering the measure itself. Clean up the tax system, get rid of that stuff, because it's not doing anything to improve Canada's competitiveness, improve our growth prospects, and improve our well-being over time.
You touched on what's going on in the United States right now. You're recommending a national commission to review taxes from all sources in an effort to make the tax system support business and make us more competitive. Are you not in favor of Elon Musk's chainsaw approach? Surely we've got a billionaire we can call to do the dirty work.
Well, what is happening in the United States is a measure of frustration that a lot of people have with the size of the public sector and its apparent imperviousness to efforts to shrink it. But there are various ways of going about it. And although Elon Musk and his company, his team are not using a literal chainsaw, what they are doing is very likely to discredit the exercise because they are going to be breaking things. I mean, if the U.S. Government's payment system stops working, then the consequences are going to be not just unpopular, but very damaging to the U.S. economy and possibly also to the U.S.'s ability to carry on a lot of the things that it's doing abroad as well. And I'm not just talking about U.S. aid. I'm talking about basic government operations. So having spent a little bit of time on that, let me emphasize there's nothing in our program that anticipates that kind of firing. In Canada, that's harder to do in any event. But we've seen the federal government grow. I emphasized already the increase in headcount, the increase in wage costs, to no apparent benefit to anybody except, of course, the people that are happy to have these jobs if they otherwise wouldn't have had anything that was as well paid or as easy to do. But what that has done, meanwhile, over the period that we're talking about, Canada's economy has been running at capacity and maybe a bit beyond. I mean, that spike in inflation that we had came partly just because demand was exceeding supply. And so one of the things that's worth remembering when you see government expanding like that is that it's squeezing something else. If private sector employers are having trouble attracting people, the unemployment rate was very low for a while. Wage gains started to pick up in a way that otherwise wouldn't have happened if you hadn't had that red hot labor market. And so the federal government was actually compressing other parts of the economy. It was absorbing resources, partly with the people, but also with the other spending it was doing that was really holding the rest of the economy back. And so I said already that when you look at the spending as a share of GDP, Don was very focused on this when we were putting the shadow budget together, saying, these look like very large cuts, but they don't even reduce the share of the government in GDP back to where it was back in the late Harper years. So what we're doing is not all that impractical, and it would certainly reduce the pressure of the federal government spending and the federal government's borrowing on the rest of the economy.
Don, your shadow budget puts us on a path to increasing defense spending, meeting our NATO commitment. In light of Trump's threat to literally invade Canada, shouldn't we be throwing more money at defense now?
Well, I really like to downplay the part of meeting NATO's commitment. That's absolutely true, and we made it a long time ago, and it's absolutely a disgrace to our country that we haven't honored it. But it's real. We can't just sit here on a wing and a prayer and hope that if anything threatens us, the United States is going to protect us. Now we know they might not. They actually may be source of our problem in some cases. We got real needs. We've got that entire area of Arctic that is pretty exposed, and there could be a lot of difficulties. It's a dangerous world. We need it for our own needs. Yes, coincidentally, it would finally satisfy a commitment we made to NATO and a lot of countries around the world. Most of them who have met that commitment, and a number of them have gone well beyond it. But we need it for our own sake, and it's a disgrace. We're at 1.3% of our GDP, and I don't even want to hang it up in the numbers. We know that even the slightest need pushes us beyond our capacity. We have huge shortfalls in the personnel. We have difficulty recruiting. We have difficulty in the retainment. We have difficulty in the training. And of course, we're woefully adequate in the equipment. And we look again on the fighter jets right now. We've been playing around with this for over a decade. Maybe we should bring back the Avro Arrow. If we still got the parts of it, we can put together and do something ourselves. But now we're realizing with all the purchase agreement we made, maybe we're too suspect to the United States. We got to go back to that drawing board. So it's not just about spending money. It's certainly not just to satisfy NATO. There are real needs, and it needs to be employed strategically and properly. And that's not that straightforward.
What we did in the shadow budget was not raise the target for the terminal amount. But we certainly accelerated it. Some of the larger purchases, and there are even questions about, the degree to which, with the way warfare is changing, some of the tanks that you might otherwise have thought made sense, some of the manned aircraft that you otherwise thought made sense, are still appropriate. But in the meantime, there is an awful lot that we can do when it comes to simply the living conditions on bases, some of the infrastructure that is needed. And so, notwithstanding some of the big ticket items that grab the headlines, we think that there's a lot of other useful ways that we can spend defense budgets so that our people in uniform are better housed, are better able to just get on with some of the less glamorous aspects of military life. And that will help with recruiting over time, because at the moment, one of the disincentives, I think, to people joining the armed forces is they look at what the living conditions are like. They hear about military bases where you can't even drink the water, and they're only human like the rest of us. That's not very appealing. If you've got better conditions, better equipment to work with, better clothing, better housing, all that, that's going to help your military effort as well. So there's lots that we can spend on and accelerate our progress toward the 2% goal, or whatever the ultimate goal is, that I think can make a big difference in the here and now.
What's your message to Canada's next finance minister, tasked with guiding us through Trump's tariffs and threats to crush us financially or literally?
Get real, recognize Canada's fundamental economic and fiscal problems, and solve them.
Treat us like adults, show us the numbers, tell us what you're going to do about it. Balance the budget. There is nothing like zero on the bottom line to focus people's minds on the choices that you have to make. As long as we're running deficits, we are going to not treat the money as seriously as we need to.
When Canadians go to the polls, what should they be thinking about when they weigh the different platforms from a financial perspective?
Is this politician and this party going to make a stronger future for Canada? I don't really care what they're offering me today, whether it's $100 off my income taxes or some kind of exemption of the GST. That's not solving my problems. That's not solving the country's problems. Are they making a stronger Canada, more resilient Canada?
We've had too much fiscal junk food pushed our way, and it has not done our health any good. We need a healthier diet.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and insight today.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Don.
Bill Robson is the president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute. Don Drummond is a fellow in residence at the Institute and a Stuffing Dunning Fellow and Adjunct Professor at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University. For the full shadow budget titled Putting Canada's Economy First, visit cdhowe.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhowe.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.